Hi everyone, I'm Shelley and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. I'm back with another Question the Narrative video today, and today's topic is satyrs, fauns, and goat men. Could they be rooted in reality? The reason that I actually started thinking about this was because a friend of mine had posted some very interesting photos of people who actually are growing what look to be horns out of their heads. These are called cutaneous growths, and I am certainly not saying that these people are satyrs, but what I'm going to say is that they did remind me of them, and it started me thinking about how so many of the stories that we hear worldwide that are kind of just blown off as being myths must be rooted in some reality because there are so many different, seemingly unrelated. I'm going to say seemingly because you know that our history has been off. Seemingly unrelated cultures coming out with the same types of stories. And so that's why I really wanted to touch on satyrs today. But first of all, before I even get to satyrs, I do want to share with you this, which she had also shared. And this is of a skull with horns, obviously, a horned skull. And there were supposedly many of these found in Pennsylvania, which happens to be the state that I live in. Unfortunately, I don't think that it's anywhere near my part of Pennsylvania. And of course, when I looked it up, you had to have the fact checkers all over it to say that it wasn't true. And to me, when the fact checkers pounce on it, that means there's something there. Because why would some obsolete story about horned skulls be so important that the fact checkers need to jump on it? Now, in case you're wondering, the connection that I am making between this horned skull and satyrs is obviously just because of the horns. When you see depictions of satyrs, they do typically have horns on their heads. We have this one here with the horns coming out, or could those be ears? They could also be ears, actually. And this one actually also just looks like an ear. We've got this interesting, I believe it's a Roman statue here. When we talk about Pan, who is I believe, is it a Greek god? Yes. Pan was a Greek nature god, and he also, trying to see if there's a photo of him here, doesn't seem that there is, but he is also often depicted with horns. It looks like there's little protrusions coming out of here. But anyway, getting back to the story at hand. So back to the horned skulls. The very first thing that I noticed was the name of the place that it was found. The horned skull of Sayre, Pennsylvania. And the reason that this got my attention is because Mount Sayre of the Bible is very often depicted affiliated with goat men or goat creatures. And the word Sayre itself means rough and hairy. Then if you move on to the term used in the Bible for satyr, yes, there are satyrs in the Bible, we'll get to that then. It is Sayre, which is very similar to Sayre, and if you ask me, very similar to Sayre. So, could be coincidence, could be not. I don't know. Of course, it was discovered in the 1880s because it seems that everything was discovered in the 1880s or 1890s. But moving on from that, Sayre is a borough in Bradford County, Pennsylvania, 59 miles northwest of Scranton. Yeah, so pretty much, yeah, very far away from me. The exact year is not clear, but during the 1880s, a large burial mound was discovered in Sayre. I'm still blown away by that name. It was reported that a group of Americans uncovered several strange human skulls and bones. The skeletons belonged to anatomically normal men, with the exception of bony projections located about 2 inches above the eyebrows. It appeared that the skulls had horns. The bones were characterized as giant, as they were representative of people over 7 feet tall. Scientists estimated that the bodies had been buried around AD 1200. The archaeological discovery was made by a reputable group of antiquarians. It was not the first time that gigantic horned skulls have been unearthed in North America. During the 19th century, similar skulls were discovered near Wellsville, New York, and in a mining village close to El Paso, Texas. At one time in history, human horns were used as signs of kingship. Alexander the Great was depicted with horns on some of his coins. I'm not sure how to say that, time, horns were a symbol of authority and power. Many gods, including Yahweh, have been depicted with horns. According to historical accounts, the Sayer bones were allegedly sent to the American Investigating Museum in Philadelphia. However, the artifacts were stolen and never seen again. Sounds like the Smithsonian. Apparent pictures of the skulls do exist, but many people claim the discovery to be a hoax. Many websites suggest that the objects are of extraterrestrial origin. I will say that I have read that the American Investigating Museum in Philadelphia, like, no one has heard of that. So that, that's a question that we have. But at the same time, we know that a lot of times details are kind of twisted to hide the truth, but the whole idea of these skulls going missing, well, we're all too familiar with that, with the giant bones. So anyway, I just wanted to share that story when it comes to the idea of satyrs, not only because of these horns, but just again, the name. The name really has significance, at least for this one. Now, obviously, they weren't all found in Sayre, Pennsylvania, but that is what really, really caught my eye once I looked into it. Now, when most people think of satyrs, or sometimes they are called fauns, depending on whether you are thinking of Greek mythology, in which they are called satyrs, or fauns, which are what they are called in Roman mythology. And actually, if you're thinking of Chronicles of Narnia, they are called fauns in Chronicles of Narnia. People usually associate them with the Greek and Roman mythology. And that certainly does seem to be where it is the most popular. But that does not mean that Greek and Roman mythology have the earliest writings of satyrs. And it also doesn't mean that they have the only writings of satyrs. There are writings and stories and legends of satyrs all over the world. Let's just read a little bit about satyrs from this website. And this is Animal Spirits of Ancient Greece. Satyrs are snub-nosed, lustful. Now, lustful is right. You might be wondering why I didn't have any really good photos of satyrs, and the reason for that is if you actually look up satyrs on your own and search images, they're pretty graphic. Lustful doesn't even begin to describe what you will find in the photos of satyrs. So I'm just telling you, if you search them, do it at your own risk. But most photos, paintings, sculptures of them, I just wasn't comfortable sharing on my channel because I know that some people watch this with, their like teenagers. So yeah, that's why I don't have any other photos. But anyway, lustful minor forest gods found in ancient Greek mythology as well as Roman that resembled goats or horses. Satyrs appear in written history in the 6th century BC in the epic poem Catalogue of Women. Homer, however, does not mention satyrs in any Homeric hymn. The origin of the word satyr is unknown, with some scholars claiming the name evolved from the Greek word for wild animal. Other scholars believe the term originated from the term sat, meaning to sow, which would refer to the satyr's appetite. So you probably understand what I'm talking about when I'm saying how they are depicted now. In Greek tradition, satyrs are nature spirits who lived in the remote woodlands or hills. These brutish spirits appear to have been feared by mortals. These drunken wild men often appear chasing the female nature spirits known as nymphs, or engaging in voluptuous dances with them. And actually, if you've ever seen the Percy Jackson movies, Grover, he's always chasing after those nymphs. And while they do it kind of lightheartedly and they make it for children, that is exactly what these satyrs were known for, was for having this, quote, appetite for women, especially nymphs. Greek satyrs are companions of the Olympian god Dionysus. Dionysus is the god of wine and fertility, usually associated with pleasurable group festivities. Being the followers of the god of wine and revelry, satyrs tended to overdrink and have an insatiable desire for sensual pleasure. Now, at the mention of Dionysus and them being companions of him, one thing that I really have to point out is that one thing that is very common among most Christians is that they tend to view like the Greek and Roman gods and gods of other mythologies as being imaginary. But what I'm discovering is that they're very likely rooted in truth, and they are very likely related to the Watchers and the Nephilim. So I'm going to say that. So if you think of satyrs as being companions of Dionysus, you shouldn't automatically just kind of say, oh, well, then it's just imaginary because Dionysus is imaginary. It is very likely that Dionysus was based on an actual being, and that Dionysus may have actually been his name, and that, yes, there may have been satyrs that were companions of his. In fact, the book of Enoch leaves a very mysterious reference about the Watchers sinning against animals. So I'm just going to read this entire thing because it's not very long, but this is from the book of Enoch, and it's chapter 7. And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives. This is talking about the Watchers. And each chose for himself one, and they began to go in unto them, and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. So I do have to point out that when it comes to the verse about, and they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, there are some people who translate that to mean that they began to eat them, because the verse before and the verse after both have to do with eating the creatures that they're speaking of. So in verse 3 it says, who consumed all the acquisitions of men, and when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. So they were eating people. And then in verse 6 it says, it's still in verse 5. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. So before it talked about the animals, it talks about them, they started eating people. And then after it speaks about animals, it talks about how they began to eat each other. And in between there, it says that they began to sin against these animals. So there are some who take it to mean that by sinning against these animals, it means that they also started eating these animals, which, it could very well be that. But there are other people who believe that because it is talking about defiling themselves, the Watchers defiling themselves with these women and the women becoming pregnant, that when they were speaking of beginning to sin against the animals, they're speaking of that. Now, whether it is of a sexual nature or of some sort of DNA kind of manipulating, I don't know. But the fact remains that that could be an answer to a question of where do creatures like this come from? Well, they could very well be, and they would be considered a type of Nephilim. And unfortunately, when these Nephilim were created, they were an abomination. So they had these, I don't know if you could call them souls, but their personifications were things that were never meant to be. And so they would have been something that was generally evil. And actually, when I came across this, it kind of made me think about that verse in Enoch. This was a goat that was born. And this does happen every once in a while, that there are animals that are born that have human-like faces. And you can only wonder, well, how does that happen? Now, it's very likely just some sort of deformity. But when we see all of these depictions of these half-human, half-animal creatures throughout worldwide history, you have to think, Now, and I also have to say that it's not very likely that a human and an animal could naturally produce offspring, which I kind of tend to lean more towards DNA manipulation because of that. But we don't know, because the Watchers had different DNA than what humans do, obviously, because that's why the giants were made. If Watchers had the exact same DNA as humans, the women just would have born, your typical babies. But they gave birth to babies who grew into giants. So there was something different. There's something different about Watcher DNA. So it may have been, I hate to say, more compatible with the animal DNA, but anyway, that's what had me, that got me thinking when I saw that. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't know, and that includes Christians, is that there are satyrs mentioned in the Bible. And a lot of people will tell you, oh, there's unicorns mentioned in the King James Version of the Bible. Yes, there are. But most people don't know that there are satyrs, and according to this, centaurs. Also, now this is from a blog by Brian Godawa, and he has written some books on giants that you might want to check out at some point. I have some of them, but I'm going to be honest and tell you that I have not read them yet, but I have heard great recommendations and that they're really good references. I just haven't had time to get to them yet. But let's just read a little bit of what he has to say. In my novels, Joshua Valiant and Caleb Vigilant, I write about a tribe called the Satyr people. Notice that name again, okay? Remember, S-E-I-R, Mount Seir. And then just remember the similarities between the name of the place in Pennsylvania where those skulls were found. Anyway. Satyr people of Banias at Mount Hermon. They live in caves at the foot of the mountains and are led by satyrs, chimeric beings with the lower body of a goat and the upper body of a human. But this mythopoeic imagery is not a mere assimilation of ancient Greek myths about Pan, the satyr deity of nature and shepherding. The notion of satyrs or goat deities predates Greek myth and finds a place in Canaanite lore and therefore the Bible as well. Take a look at these prophecies of Isaiah referencing the destruction of Babylon and Edom. And I do have to say that very often Edomites are also associated with goat men. Isaiah 34:11-15. But the hawk and the porcupine shall possess it, the owl and the raven shall dwell in it. Thorns shall grow over its strongholds, nettles and thistles in its fortresses. It shall be the haunt of jackals, an abode for ostriches, and wild animals shall meet with hyenas. The wild goat, the word used is serim, shall cry to his fellow. Indeed, there the night bird settles and finds for herself a resting place. There the owl nests and lays and hatches and gathers her young in her shadow. Indeed, there the hawks are gathered, each one with her mate. And then Isaiah 13:21-22 says, but wild animals will lie down there, and their houses will be full of howling creatures. There ostriches will dwell, and their wild goats, again, serim, will dance. Hyenas will cry in its towers, and jackals in the pleasant palaces. Its time is close at hand, and its days will not be prolonged. The passages above speak of God's judgment upon the nations of Babylon and Edom, symbols of all that is against Israel and Yahweh. A cursory reading of the text seems to indicate a common word picture of Yahweh destroying these nations so thoroughly that they end up a desert wasteland with wild animals and birds inhabiting them because the evil people will be no more. Nothing about mythical monsters like satyrs there, right? Wrong. Because the English translations of the Hebrew word serim as wild goats obscure the full ancient meaning. If we look closer into the original Hebrew, we find a more expanded mythopoeic reference to pagan deities. A quick look at the Septuagint translation into Greek made by ancient Jews in the 2nd century before Christ. We find the hint of that different picture. So these are the same verses, but they're going to be translated specifically from the Hebrew. And I'm not going to read the whole, well, yeah, I will read the whole thing because I see it's filled. And for a long time, and again, this is Isaiah 34, 13 to 14. And for a long time, birds and hedgehogs and ibises and ravens shall dwell in it, and the measuring line of desolation shall be cast over it, and satyrs shall dwell in it, and thorns shall spring up their cities, and in her strongholds, and they shall be habitations of monsters, and a court for ostriches, and devils shall meet with satyrs, and they shall cry one to the other. There shall satyrs rest, having found for themselves a place of rest. And I'm just curious what is used instead of devils there. Let me see. 31, 13 to 14. The wild goat. Indeed, they're nightbird. Is it nightbird? Devils shall meet with satyrs. This seems like so different. And wild animals shall meet with hyenas. So it calls them hyenas in that translation, but it should be devils. So really, we really need to question the translations that we're using. And are we getting the full meaning? Isaiah 13, 21 to 22 says, but wild beasts shall rest there, and the houses shall be filled with howling, and monsters shall rest there, and devils shall dance there, and satyrs shall dwell there. So again, let's just quickly look back, and it says, let's see, what shall rest there? It says ostriches will dwell. Oh, howling creatures is what it uses for monsters, but you don't quite get the same depiction. And it says ostriches will dwell, and their wild goats will dance. And it says devils shall dance there, and satyrs shall dwell there. So yeah, we're not getting the whole picture when we read our typical Bibles. Wow, what a dramatic difference. Of course, the Septuagint passages above are not in Greek, but are English translations, which adds a layer of complication that we will unravel shortly to reveal even more mythopoeic elements. And I am going to link in the description for this if you want to read all of it. I'll read a little bit more, but I'm not going to read the whole article. Also, this one here, I think it was this one. Yeah, it started getting a little graphic. So I'm going to link this in the description if you would like to read this too. But I chose to just kind of move on from this after reading a little bit of it because I saw where it was headed. Because, yeah, that's what you get when you study satyrs, I guess. So anyway, in Isaiah 34:14 of the ESV, we read of the wild goat crying to his fellow. And in 13:21, their wild goats will dance. But the underlying Hebrew, serim, is not about wild goats, but satyrs that were prevalent in Canaanite religion. Scholar Judd Burton points out that Banias or Panias at the base of Mount Hermon in Bashan was a key worship site for the Greek goat god Pan as early as the 3rd century BC and earlier connections to the goat idol Azazel. And it also says the Bible writers considered these pagan serum deities to be demons and thus called them goat demons. So prevalent and influential were these satyr gods that Yahweh would have trouble with Israel worshiping them as idols. Leviticus 17:7 says, so they shall no more sacrifice their sacrifices to goat demons after whom they whore. This shall be a statute forever for them throughout their generations. And 2 Chronicles 11:15 says, Jeroboam appointed his own priests for the high places and for the goat idols and for the calves that he had made. And goat idols, again, is serum. Not only did Israel fall into worshiping the serum in Canaan, they were even committing spiritual adultery with them while in the wilderness. It is no wonder Yahweh considered them demonic, a declaration reiterated in Moses' own prophecy. that after Israel would be brought into Canaan by the hand of God, she would betray Yahweh by turning aside to other gods, redefined as demons. So again, I will leave a link to this in the description box. So yes, satyrs are in the Bible. It's not just Greek and Roman mythology. And guess what? These also are not the only places where they are. Here we have some more stories of what is called the goat man. And this is actually in the US. So let's see if we can read a little bit about it. So the goat man. The name gives you a little insight into what we're talking about. A hybrid of sorts who walks on the legs of a goat and stands tall as a man. A creature who doesn't belong in the world of man, nor it belongs out in nature. Something that unfortunately brings the violence of the wild into civilization. Or simply put, it's a weird looking thing that likes to trash humans. And remember I talked about that. I mean, it's saying it kind of in a funny way, but they're not good creatures, no matter how you look at it, because they are an abomination. And another thing I want to point out very quickly though, is that these are like modern sightings. So we tend to think of these things as being, thousands of years ago. If they were possibly true, they would be thousands of years ago. No, there are sightings of them still in modern times. There are multiple goat men around America, and not one of them is civilized. They all live under bridges. It makes you think of the three Billy Goats Gruff. Where does that story come from? They all live under bridges or beyond the city limits, and they surface only to attack people. But you can't talk about the goat man unless you choose which one, because there are more of them. So let's just read about the different goat men. So the Maryland goatman. Throughout the 1970s, several Maryland residents found dead dogs around their neighborhoods. People became frightened, and different versions explaining the event came and went. Boring, rational people quickly blamed the entire thing on the railroad tracks, where dogs unlucky enough tried to cross and were hit by a train. Other residents, and many of them were claimed to be eyewitnesses of the event, blamed it on the goat man. As the rumors of such a creature grew stronger, Maryland residents found the words, "The goat man was here," written on their building walls. A literate goat man is to be feared. The genesis of the Maryland goat man could have a Stan Lee twist of sorts. Several residents have told the story of a scientist who worked in the Agricultural Research Center of Maryland who, in comic book fashion, became the goat man after a failed experiment with a goat. It's like Spider-Man, but less cool. I just want to go back and read the actual description. The goat man is a half-man, half-goat hybrid. That means approximately 50% man and 50% goat. How exactly are those proportions distributed? Well, it's not what you're thinking. It's not a creature with the legs of a man and the head of a goat, or the head of a man and the horns of a goat. That's a good guess, but far from accurate. Science shows us the goat man is half goat from the waist down and half man from the waist up. Certain groups, such as the goat headers, claim the goat man has a goat head, but little to no scientific evidence supports this claim. The top researchers around the world make it clear, if you want to know whether you're facing a goat man, check his legs, not his goatee. And I do have to say that there's one very famous depiction of a goat man who actually does have the head of a goat and the legs of a man, and that would be the Baphomet. Next, we'll read about the Pope Lick monster. Our second goat man might not know how to read or write, but he has a known address, the railroad bridge in Pope Lick Creek. Now you might be thinking, how come the Maryland goatman knows how to read and write and this one doesn't? Well, the answer is simple. This one knows magic, so he doesn't need to write. I don't know where it said that he knew how to read and write, but anyway. That's right. Many witnesses claim to have seen this goat man use hypnosis and voice mimicry to lure his victims. When he has them within reach, he grabs them and throws them under a train. Apparently, that's how a half-man, half-goat has fun, because he doesn't have a TV. How such a wretched creature came to be? There are many stories, but two of them are the most interesting. The first version claims the goat man was a circus freak who vowed to get revenge on humans who are not half man and half goat, but instead are half man and half man. Okay. The second version talks about a farmer who sacrificed goats in exchange for satanic powers. He died and came back half a goat. I'm not sure how that qualifies as a satanic power, but I digress. Anyway, the Waterford sheepman. He died and came back half a goat. Anyway, yeah, sorry. I was just distracted. The Waterford sheepman. The third and final goat man is the most dangerous of them all. A half man, half goat creature featuring sharp claws, scales, and fur. Something that can only be described as clumsy design. The Waterford sheepman. Waterford residents call him a sheepman, but he's most definitely goat man. Doesn't hide in bridges or around the neighborhood. He attacks head on. Waterford residents have claimed time and time again a half-man, half-goat creature roams around their town, jumping on top of cars and assaulting people. When he can't reach cars or people, he throws rocks, tires, and everything he can grab at them. Even though we don't know the mythical genesis of the sheepman, we might have a little clue on what happened throughout the 60s, when sheepman activity was at its peak. Back in 2005, a man sent an anonymous letter to a reporter. In that letter, he explained he and his friends were bored and decided to scare people wearing Goatman costumes. A terrible ending. It's just a prank, bro, strikes again. Which, let's hope not, because apparently this thing killed people. Faun, fairy, or reality. As we now know, one of three Goatmen is certainly fake. And I have to say that I wonder about that, because there have been, quote, confessions about the Bigfoot, the Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot recording. Like, people have come out and said that it was them. But as it turns out, that was not even the case. So, again, let's just hope that it wasn't them, because if this thing hurt people, that's not really a good prank. Anyway, whether these two wild hybrids are real or not, it's hard to tell. While the Pope Lick monster seems far-fetched because of the mystic powers, people have died after mysteriously falling under a train where this Goatman supposedly lives. The Maryland Goatman was a big thing throughout the 1970s, but quickly came and went as people from the town moved on to other things. Perhaps he died, maybe he never existed. And I do have to say that it does, especially with our 21st century minds. We look at stories like this and we're like, that's absurd. That's ridiculous. That's too far-fetched. But I think that a lot of times we let our, quote, intellect get in the way, and we are completely overlooking things that were very, very real to our ancestors and to people all over the world. And I also have to say that I have actually had a few people comment in the past telling me that they had witnessed a Goatman. And I wish I would have taken screenshots of those comments, and it is so hard. I wish that YouTube would have some way of searching comments with keywords or something, but they don't. So I haven't been able to go back and find them. But if you are one of those people who has commented on that before, please leave another comment and share your story with us. So we've talked about satyrs of Greek and Roman mythology. We have talked about the Canaanite origins. We have talked about satyrs in the Bible. And now we have talked about satyr-like creatures in the Americas. Well, there's more. We have some stories of satyr-like creatures in different parts of the world as well. The wild man Enkidu in ancient Mesopotamia. The earliest surviving mention of a wild man is the Enkidu. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Enki's creation in the Epic of Gilgamesh, written more than 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Enkidu is a central figure in the epic, in which he is described as an uncivilized savage who was raised by animals and lived with herds and game in the wild. He is the embodiment of the natural world and is the opposite of the cultured and eloquent hero Gilgamesh. And let's not forget that Pan is a nature god, part man and part goat. Pan was the god of wild groves, shepherds, and flocks. Born in Arcadia to Hermes and a dryad, Pan was a precocious child. And I'm going to say, you know, his father was Hermes, who was a Greek god. And we have to think to ourselves, is this connected to the Watchers? And could they actually have been the offspring of the Watchers? So, Pan was a precocious child whose goat's feet and horned head delighted gods but startled mortals. Nymphs weren't too happy with his looks either, and as much as Pan loved them, they almost never loved him back. So he's the son of Hermes and a dryad, and the reason that I came over here was just to show you that he's the god of wild groves, shepherds, and flocks, and basically a nature god. And if you look, let's see, where were we at? So if we do look here, it says that he was an uncivilized savage who was raised by animals and lived with herds and game in the wild, and he's the embodiment of the natural world. So yes, that would certainly go right along with Pan as well. Unlike many other wild men in other legends, Enkidu is able to be tamed. He is taught the ways of the civilized world by a prostitute after spending 7 days enjoying her company, which resulted in the animals rejecting him when they sensed her human scent on him. Wondering if that is akin to the types of things we see in Greek and Roman mythology. So, both Greek and Roman myths are filled with voracious wild men. The satyr and faun are both wild men associated with fertility. Both the Greek god Pan and his Roman equivalent Faunus are depictions of the wild man figure, and both are gods of nature and the wild, but also of fertility. The Romans also describe a Celtic figure called Dusios. They compared the pagan god to their god Faunus and the Greek god Pan, but are careful to emphasize the savage nature of Dusios to differentiate between him and their own wild men. Dusios is not just a fertility god, he is described as impregnating both animals and women, either by surprise or by force. Historians believe these features are all rooted in ancient legends from Neolithic cultures across modern-day Europe and Russia. They point to the Slavic creature known as the Leshy, which is described as a short humanoid forest guardian with a large bushy beard and tail. The Leshy is rumored to capture children and travelers if they do not respect his forest. Although some people have linked the Leshy and creatures like the satyr, the Leshy is not associated with fertility and is closer to our modern Bigfoot legends than the Greco-Roman concepts of wild men. And here we have medieval beliefs of wild men. The legend of the wild man remained a part of European culture and sources from the 9th and 10th centuries. One Spanish source, which describes the penance given for certain behaviors, mentions the minor penalty faced by those who dressed up as wild men and took part in a dance, which was a resurgence of earlier pagan practice. Around the same time in the 9th century, Irish folklore describes how a pagan king is driven mad when he attacks a Catholic bishop, eventually transforming into a beast who roams the woods. The Konungsskuggsja, an educational Norwegian text from the 13th century, describes a creature very similar to other descriptions of wild men. The text says the strange creature was like a human, but with a great deal of coarse hair. It says the creature was captured in the woods in Ireland, and that no one could tell if it understood human speech or not. And here are some more, they're later medieval wild men. And we have artwork here. And yes, that certainly does look similar to a satyr. So yeah, the whole point of this is that I'm just thinking to myself, a lot of us have no issue thinking about that Sasquatch could possibly be real, or that people even think that mermaids could be real, or the reptilians. But often when you think about things like satyrs, you're like, okay, no, that's where I draw the line. But you've got modern day sightings of what could be called goat men in the Americas. In the Americas, in a place where typically that sort of folklore is outright rejected. You know, and in my troll video, I talked about how a lot of people who live in Northern Europe, especially in Scandinavia, they still insist that trolls are real and that they still exist today. There are people who still insist, I think in Norway, that gnomes are real and still exist today. There are people in Iceland who insist that elves exist today. And I am not going to discount any of their opinions because we are finding out more and more that the things that we always were brought up to believe were fairy tale are, in fact, the truth. That's all that I have for you today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave one either here or over on Instagram. And if you like my work and would like to check out my Patreon page, I will leave a link in the description box for that as well. And I hope you have a great day.